Let's go to the US now, where Donald Trump has posted a $175 million bond in his New York civil fraud case. In February, he was found to have fraudulently inflated property values. It means he can now proceed with his appeal against a $454 million fine without the possible seizure of his assets. Mr. Trump claims it's all a political witch hunt. Of course, this is just one of several court cases he's facing, with others being criminal cases, with the potential for Mr. Trump to be jailed if convicted. As a reminder, let's look at the 4 criminal cases which the former president is facing. Well, there is the New York hush money case concerning a payment made to the adult film actress Stormy Daniels shortly before the 2016 election. Mr. Trump is facing 34 counts of fraud under campaign finance laws and has pleaded not guilty to all of them. Meanwhile, in Georgia, Donald Trump and some 18 other defendants are accused of criminally conspiring to overturn his very narrow defeat in the state of Georgia in the 2020 election. This case involves a huge racketeering investigation. Mr. Trump was facing 13 criminal counts, 3 of which have been dismissed by a judge. Again, Mr. Trump has entered a plea of not guilty. Another case involves allegations that Mr. Trump pressured officials to reverse the 2020 election results, knowingly spread lies about election fraud, and sought to exploit the Capitol riot on the 6th of January 2021 to delay the certification of Mr. Biden's victory and stay in power. He's been charged with 4 criminal counts and denies any wrongdoing. Finally, there's the classified documents case concerning whether the former president mishandled files by taking them from the White House to his Mar-a-Lago residence after he left office. There are 8 individual counts, all of which Mr.
Okay, so this is absolutely massive. And if you haven't been paying attention, you need to understand what just happened, because it could literally dismantle Trump's entire financial empire. A federal judge has ordered a freeze on all Trump Organization assets. All of them. Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, the golf courses, the hotels. Every business account, every property, everything. Frozen. As in, Trump can't sell anything, can't transfer anything, can't leverage anything. His entire financial empire is essentially paralyzed by court order. And this isn't some temporary hold while paperwork gets sorted out. This is a sweeping emergency action triggered by bombshell evidence of systematic fraud that allegedly went on for years. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about something. The specific details of this asset freeze are based primarily on new media reporting, and the exact scope and current status may be evolving as appeals and legal challenges proceed. But what we're looking at, according to available reports, is an extraordinary judicial action that almost never happens to someone of Trump's wealth and status. Because freezing all assets of a major business empire before final legal resolution is the nuclear option. It's what courts do when they believe someone is about to hide money, move assets offshore, or otherwise make it impossible to collect on a judgment. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Mr. Trump has pleaded not guilty to. All of this comes to a total of 91 criminal charges across the 4 cases. But let's turn to that civil case, which of course does not involve criminal charges and was brought in a lawsuit by New York Attorney General Letitia James. The case was brought using a law that gives the state's Attorney General broad power to investigate allegations of persistent fraud and illegality in business dealings. And we'll be able to get into that with our next guest. Joining me is Sarah Krisoff, former prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. Sarah, just give us some more details about the civil case that Mr. Trump is facing.
Yes, the Attorney General used what is in her power to do. Used some very broad statutes in New York to prosecute these crimes, to charge the former president, his...
So what triggered this? According to reports, it's connected to fraud allegations that Trump systematically lied about property values, inflated assets to get better loan terms, deflated them to pay less taxes, and basically manipulated his financial statements for years to defraud banks, insurers, and investors. Now, if you've been following Trump's legal troubles, you know there have been fraud allegations before. The New York Attorney General has been investigating his business practices. There have been civil suits, but this asset freeze represents an escalation to a completely different level, because you don't freeze someone's entire business empire unless you have serious evidence and serious concerns that they're going to try to hide assets before you can collect. The order reportedly covers everything: Trump Tower in New York, one of his signature properties; Mar-a-Lago in Florida, where he lives and operates his private club; golf courses across multiple states and countries; hotels; licensing deals; business accounts; personal accounts. The whole empire that Trump built his identity and political brand around is now locked down by federal court order. And here's what makes this particularly dramatic. The freeze reportedly empowers government authorities to potentially seize, liquidate, or sell off these assets if Trump doesn't pay the full fraud judgment that's been assessed against him. We're not just talking about preventing him from moving money around. We're talking about the possibility of the government actually taking Trump Tower, selling Mar-a-Lago, liquidating his golf courses to satisfy the judgment. That's an absolutely stunning development for someone who's built his entire image around being a successful real estate mogul and businessman. According to reports, prosecutors argued the freeze was necessary because Trump failed to post the required bond. Now, in major fraud cases, defendants are often required to post a bond, which is basically money held in escrow to guarantee they can pay if they lose. It's a way of making sure that by the time the case is resolved, the defendant hasn't hidden or spent all their assets. And if Trump couldn't or wouldn't post that bond, it raises serious red flags for the court. Because if someone with Trump's claimed wealth can't come up with the bond money, either they don't have as much money as they claim, or they're deliberately refusing to cooperate, or they're already moving assets around in ways that would make collection difficult. Any of those scenarios would justify a court stepping in with an emergency asset freeze. The reported date for this order is October 16th, 2025, which means this is recent. This is happening right now. And the implications are staggering, both legally and politically. Legally, this puts Trump in an incredibly difficult position. With his assets frozen, he can't easily pay legal fees for all his various cases. He can't use his properties as collateral for loans. He can't liquidate assets to raise cash. He's essentially trapped in a financial vice where the courts control access to his own money and property. Politically, this is devastating to Trump's brand and image. His entire political identity is built on being a successful businessman, someone who knows how to make deals, someone who's rich and therefore supposedly uncorruptible. But if his assets are frozen because of fraud allegations, if the government is threatening to seize his properties, that narrative falls apart completely. How can you run on being a successful businessman when the courts have frozen your business because they think you're a fraud? The reported immediate impact has been panic among Trump's legal and financial teams, because when you can't access your assets, everything becomes harder. You can't easily pay lawyers. You can't make payroll for your businesses. You can't cover operating expenses for properties. And according to some reports, there's been market reaction too, with Trump-linked stocks and bonds dropping as investors realize the company might be forced into liquidation. So let's dig into exactly what this asset freeze means, how it happened, and what comes next. Because this could be the beginning of the end for the Trump organization as we know it. Alright, so let's get into the details of what an asset freeze actually means and why this is such an extraordinary step for a court to take. First, we need to understand that freezing someone's assets before a final judgment is resolved is really unusual, especially when we're talking about a business empire as large as Trump's. Courts generally don't want to shut down operating businesses or prevent people from accessing their property unless there's a compelling reason. Because if it turns out the defendant wins the case, you've potentially destroyed their business for no good reason. So when a court does issue a sweeping asset freeze, it's because they have evidence that convinces them the defendant is likely to hide, move, or dissipate assets if they're not stopped. It's based on a finding that there's a serious risk the plaintiff won't be able to collect on a judgment if they win because the money will be gone by then. In Trump's case, according to available reports, the trigger was his failure to post a required bond, combined with evidence of systematic fraud in his financial dealings. Let's break down what that means. When you're facing a massive civil judgment, courts often require you to post a bond. This is essentially money or assets that get held in a secure account to guarantee you can pay if you lose. The bond amount is usually set based on the size of the potential judgment plus interest and costs. In a fraud case involving alleged manipulation of billions of dollars in assets, the bond requirement would be substantial. We're potentially talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that Trump would need to put up. Now, if Trump claims to be worth billions, posting a bond of a few hundred million shouldn't be a problem. You can use your assets as collateral. You can get a bond company to issue it. There are ways to do this if you actually have the wealth you claim to have. But if Trump can't or won't post the bond, that tells the court something important. Either he doesn't have the liquid assets or borrowing capacity to come up with the money, which would suggest his actual wealth is much less than claimed, or he's refusing to post it as a strategy, perhaps to avoid tying up assets, or to maintain flexibility to move money around, or he's already moved assets in ways that make it difficult to use them as collateral for a bond. Any of these scenarios would justify a court stepping in with an emergency freeze, because if a defendant won't secure their ability to pay a potential judgment voluntarily, the court has to do it involuntarily. That's exactly what asset freezes are for. Now, let's talk about the scope of this reported freeze. According to available information, it covers all Trump Organization assets and Trump's personal holdings. That's an incredibly broad order. It means Trump can't sell Trump Tower to raise cash. He can't transfer ownership of Mar-a-Lago to family members or shell companies. He can't use his golf courses as collateral for new loans. He can't move money between accounts in ways that might hide it from collection efforts. Everything is frozen in place, preserved for potential satisfaction of the judgment. The practical implications of this are severe. If you own a business and all your assets are frozen, how do you operate? You still have expenses. You have payroll. You have maintenance costs on properties. You have utilities, insurance, property taxes. All of that still needs to be paid. But if your accounts are frozen, how do you pay it? Typically, asset freeze orders include provisions for ordinary business expenses to continue. The court doesn't want to completely shut down operations, but there are limits. You can pay normal operating costs, but you can't make extraordinary payments. You can't pay huge bonuses to executives. You can't transfer large sums to related entities. Everything has to go through court approval, or at least court monitoring. For someone like Trump, who's used to having complete control over his business empire, this level of judicial oversight and restriction has to be maddening. He can't make major business decisions without court approval. He can't restructure his companies. He can't sell properties even if it would make business sense. He's essentially operating his business under court supervision. And there's another implication that's particularly concerning for Trump. According to reports, the freeze order empowers authorities to potentially seize and liquidate assets if he doesn't pay the judgment. This means if Trump loses the fraud case and the judgment is affirmed on appeal, and if he still can't or won't pay, the government can literally take his properties and sell them to satisfy the debt. We could see Trump Tower auctioned off, Mar-a-Lago seized and sold, his golf courses liquidated. For someone whose entire identity is wrapped up in his properties and his brand, this is an existential threat. It's not just about money at that point. It's about the humiliation of watching the government seize and sell the properties he's built his life around. Now let's talk about the underlying fraud allegations that led to this freeze. The claims, based on investigations by New York authorities and others, are that Trump systematically manipulated financial statements for years. The pattern allegedly worked like this. When he wanted to get loans or impress investors, he'd inflate the value of his properties and assets. He claimed Mar-a-Lago was worth hundreds of millions more than it actually was. He'd overstate the square footage of his properties. He'd inflate his cash on hand. But then when it came time to pay taxes, he'd do the opposite. He'd deflate the values to minimize his tax liability. Same properties that were worth hundreds of millions for loan applications were suddenly worth much less for tax purposes. This kind of manipulation, if proven, is fraud. It's lying to banks, which is bank fraud. It's lying to insurance companies to get better rates, which is insurance fraud. It's lying to tax authorities, which is tax fraud. And doing it systematically over many years as part of your standard business practice elevates it from isolated incidents to a pattern of criminal enterprise. The evidence that allegedly supports these fraud claims includes financial statements that Trump signed personally, documents where the values don't match objective appraisals, testimony from Trump Organization employees about how these statements were prepared, and comparisons between what Trump told different entities about the same properties. When your loan documents say a property is worth $500 million, but your tax filings say it's worth $50 million, and there's no legitimate reason for that discrepancy, that's evidence of fraud. And apparently the evidence in this case was strong enough that the judge concluded an emergency asset freeze was necessary. Because courts don't take this step lightly. The judge has to find that there's likely fraud, that there's a serious risk of assets being hidden or dissipated, and that a freeze is necessary to protect the plaintiff's ability to collect if they prevail. All of those findings had to be made here. Now Trump's legal team is undoubtedly fighting this freeze hard. They're filing emergency appeals. They're arguing the freeze is overly broad, that it will destroy the business, that there's no real risk of assets disappearing. But here's the problem. If Trump can't post the bond that was required, how does he argue there's no risk of assets disappearing? If he has all this wealth but can't access it to post a bond, where is it? And if he can access it but chooses not to, why should the court trust that he won't move it somewhere unreachable if the freeze is lifted? These are difficult questions for the defense to answer. The political implications of this asset freeze are enormous. Trump has been campaigning on his business success, his deal-making ability, his wealth as proof he can't be bought. But if his business empire is frozen because of fraud allegations, if the government is threatening to seize his most iconic properties, that whole narrative collapses. His opponents will use this to argue he's a fraud who built his fortune on lies. His supporters will claim it's political persecution, an attempt to bankrupt him to prevent him from running for office. And somewhere in between those extremes is the legal reality of what's actually happening in court. The financial impact extends beyond just Trump's ability to access his money. If the Trump organization is essentially paralyzed by this freeze, it affects everyone who does business with it. Vendors who provide services to Trump properties might not get paid. Employees might face uncertainty about their jobs. Banks that have loans to Trump entities might worry about repayment. Investors in Trump-related ventures might panic. The ripple effects of freezing such a large business empire are significant. And that's before we even get to the potential liquidation. If Trump loses the case, if properties actually get seized and sold, that's a market event. It affects commercial real estate values. It affects how other properties in the same areas are valued. It sends a message to wealthy defendants in other cases that the courts will follow through on asset freezes and collections. Now, we need to acknowledge that the exact details of this freeze, including its current status and scope, are still evolving. Trump is undoubtedly filing every appeal and emergency motion possible to get it lifted or limited, and some of those appeals might succeed. Courts of appeals sometimes find that trial judges went too far with asset freezes. They might narrow the scope or lift parts of it while keeping other restrictions in place. So the situation is fluid. But even if the freeze gets partially lifted, the fact that it was imposed at all is significant. It shows a judge found sufficient evidence of fraud and risk of asset dissipation to take extraordinary action. That finding, even if later modified, is damaging in itself. Okay, so let's break this down into what you actually need to understand, because this is complex and there's potential for details to evolve. Point 1, according to available reports, a federal judge has ordered a freeze on Trump Organization assets. This reportedly includes all major properties, business accounts, and holdings. The freeze allegedly prevents Trump from selling, transferring, or leveraging these assets. This is based on new media reporting, and the exact scope and current legal status should be verified through official court documents as the situation develops. Point 2, the reported trigger for this freeze was Trump's failure to post the required bond, combined with evidence of systematic fraud in his financial dealings. When defendants can't or won't post bonds in major civil cases, it raises red flags for courts about whether they'll be able to collect if they win. Combined with fraud evidence that justified the extraordinary step of freezing assets. Point 3, the reported scope is extraordinarily broad. Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, golf courses, hotels, business and personal accounts. Everything allegedly frozen pending resolution of the fraud case. This level of asset freeze is rare and typically reserved for situations where courts believe defendants will hide or dissipate assets if not stopped. Point 4, according to reports, the order empowers authorities to potentially seize and liquidate assets if Trump doesn't pay the judgment. This means the government could theoretically auction off Trump properties to satisfy the debt. That would be a stunning outcome for someone whose identity is built around his real estate empire. Point 5, the practical impact is severe. With assets frozen, Trump can't easily access money to pay legal fees, can't use properties as collateral, can't restructure his business. He's essentially operating under court supervision, which is a massive constraint for someone used to having complete control. So what does all this actually mean? Well, first, it means Trump faces a potential financial crisis on top of all his legal problems. Legal battles are expensive. If you can't access your assets to pay lawyers, to post bonds in other cases, to cover the costs of appeals and motions, your ability to fight becomes limited. You might have to accept settlements you wouldn't otherwise accept. You might have to plead guilty to charges you would otherwise fight. Financial pressure is one of the most effective tools prosecutors and plaintiffs have. Second, it undermines Trump's core political brand. His whole campaign pitch has been that he's a successful businessman who's rich enough that he can't be bought or corrupted. But if his business empire is frozen because of fraud allegations, if he couldn't post a bond despite claiming to be worth billions, that brand falls apart. His opponents will hammer him as a fraud, and while his base might dismiss it as political persecution, independent voters might see it as evidence that Trump's business success was always exaggerated or built on illegal practices. Third, it shows that even the wealthy and powerful can face real accountability through the court system. Asset freezes and potential property seizures are not things that usually happen to former presidents or billionaire businessmen. The fact that a judge was willing to take this step signals that the evidence of fraud must be substantial, because judges know these kinds of orders get appealed aggressively, and they know they'll be scrutinized for whether they went too far. So when a judge imposes a freeze this broad, they believe the evidence justifies it. Fourth, it creates practical chaos for Trump's business operations. Even with provisions for ordinary business expenses, operating a business empire with all your assets frozen is incredibly difficult. Every major decision needs court approval or oversight. You can't respond quickly to market opportunities. You can't restructure to deal with financial problems. You're essentially in a legal straitjacket that makes effective business management nearly impossible. Now let's talk about what happens next. Trump's lawyers are certainly fighting this freeze with everything they have. They're filing emergency appeals, arguing the freeze is overly broad and will destroy the business. They're seeking stays pending appeal. They're trying to get parts of the freeze lifted even if they can't get all of it removed, and they might have some success. Appeals courts sometimes find that trial judges went too far with asset freezes. They might narrow the scope to cover only specific properties or accounts rather than everything. They might allow certain transactions that can be shown to be legitimate business needs. But even if parts of the freeze get lifted, having any asset freeze in place is a serious problem. It signals judicial concern about fraud and asset dissipation that won't go away just because the freeze gets narrowed. The underlying fraud case will continue to proceed through the courts. There will be more hearings, potentially a trial if it hasn't already happened, appeals of any adverse judgment. That process can take months or even years, and the longer the asset freeze stays in place, the more pressure it puts on Trump to settle or to find ways to pay the judgment, because operating indefinitely with frozen assets is not sustainable for most businesses. There's also the question of political impact. Trump is running for president again, and having his business empire frozen by court order is not a good look. His campaign will have to address it. They'll call it political persecution. They'll argue he's being targeted because he's a political threat. But they'll also have to explain why he couldn't post a bond if he's actually as wealthy as he claims. And that's a difficult question to answer without admitting either that he's not as rich as claimed or that he's deliberately refusing to cooperate with court orders. Donors and supporters will have to decide whether this changes their view of Trump. For his base, it probably won't. They'll see it as more evidence of the system being rigged against him. But for independent voters and moderate Republicans who might be on the fence, seeing Trump's assets frozen because of fraud allegations could be a deciding factor. It feeds into existing concerns about his honesty and his business practices. From a legal precedent standpoint, this case could set important standards for how courts handle asset preservation in fraud cases involving the wealthy and powerful. Traditionally, there's been a reluctance to freeze assets of major businesses because of the collateral damage it can cause. But if courts become more willing to use this tool when there's evidence of systematic fraud, it could change how white-collar crime and civil fraud cases are litigated going forward. Now, we need to be clear about what we know and what we don't know. The reporting on this asset freeze comes primarily from new media sources, and the exact details, including the current status after any appeals, may be evolving. Major traditional news outlets may have additional reporting or different details. So while the general outline of what's being reported is clear, asset freeze based on fraud allegations covering Trump's business empire, the specific current legal status should be verified through official court documents and comprehensive news coverage. With that caveat, the reported freeze represents an extraordinary judicial action that, if accurately reported, puts Trump in the most severe financial jeopardy he's faced. The possibility of the government actually seizing and selling Trump Tower or Mar-a-Lago is not just theoretical. That's what asset freezes lead to when defendants can't pay judgments. Properties get seized and auctioned off to satisfy debts. So watch for appeals court decisions on whether the freeze stands or gets modified. Watch for reporting on how Trump's business operations are being affected. Watch for political fallout as Trump tries to campaign while his business empire is locked down by court order. And watch for whether this leads to settlement discussions, because facing the possibility of losing your entire business empire might make even the most stubborn defendant willing to negotiate. This is a developing story with potentially massive implications. It could end with Trump losing his most iconic properties. It could end with a settlement that allows him to keep some assets while paying a massive judgment. Or it could end with the freeze being lifted if appeals courts find it was too broad. But regardless of the ultimate outcome, the fact that we're even at the point where a court has frozen the Trump organization's assets is extraordinary. It's the kind of thing that happens to mob bosses and corrupt officials, not usually to former presidents and current presidential candidates. And that's exactly why it's such a big deal.